Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that we are all doing well today as we are moving on through and beginning week 3 here. So there's actually only 2 more full weeks of classes, 4 more discussion boards. So time is moving quickly, but I'm really impressed by the caliber of work that I'm seeing so far, and just really how you're all stretching your thinking and really stretching mine. So I really have appreciated that. Before I begin today's lecture, I wanted to say something really quick. As I've been uploading these to YouTube, and hopefully I won't have any other problems with them being private versus public, but as I'm recording myself and doing this lecture, I can't press pause. And normally, sometimes I need to think before I speak, so I don't always know if things are coming out the way I intend. And as I'm listening to myself, of course, I always have my own self-reflection about how things might be perceived, how I might reword things. I'm checking my own privileges, assumptions, and things that just come out as we are going through these conversations. And so, just to highlight, I was thinking about this similarly when I brought up talking about my own religious background and my positionality, which I haven't fully shared with everybody. But as I was listening to myself, I thought, I might be perceived as suggesting that because somebody follows a particular religion, this boxes you in as being either liberal or conservative, and I realized that that's not the case either. So I actually added a note up here in the video. I don't know if anyone actually saw it here. So something I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is that on the YouTube page, there are options to add comments. So should you have any questions for me, or maybe there's something that I said that you don't quite understand or agree with, certainly let's use this space that to be able to talk back and forth to one another, or to ask me further questions if that would be helpful. I might also use this space too to add a comment after I listen to myself and reflect on what I've said and such. So that's that. With that being said, I want to add that up on the website, I've added this folder, Supplemental Documents, in which I might put some more things up here that would be useful. One of the PDFs that I put up here today is LGBTQ terminology. This came out of UCLA, and it's a really extensive list about different ways of different terms, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but instead of me sitting here and going through every specific term, this might be a good resource for you to keep on file so that you have when you're thinking about language. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Additionally, the piece by Pennell was citing Tara Yasso's work, and I've included that piece on cultural capital up here if you hadn't read it before and would be interested in reading that piece. So that's up here as well. And I'll use this folder from now on to add any additional resources like that I might come across. Okay. So this week, we're moving into gender and sexuality, and as I have here, couldn't be a more suiting topic for the week, considering that today on June 26th, as I'm recording this lecture, the Supreme Court just ruled for marriage equality in a 5-4 vote. So this was a post. This is from the Huffington Post. And I've been seeing, it's been trending all over Facebook and Twitter, and there's, of course, different reactions. We are not all on the same side in how we as a American society view same-sex marriage, and which is why we are continuing to have these conversations and thinking about these things in society. Okay. So a couple of terms that came up in the readings today that I'll talk about more specifically. Symbolic violence and cultural capital. These are some things that both Pennell and Serrier talk about in their pieces. Coming out of Pierre Bourdieu's work, he's a French sociologist, and he became known with coining this term cultural capital, which we've talked a little bit about before. And there's actually 4 different types of capital that he writes about throughout his work. There's economic capital, thinking about wealth, social capital, your status, that cultural capital, that has a lot to do with your education, and then also the symbolic capital, which goes hand in hand with symbolic violence, and this has to do with symbols. It's a set of symbols that legitimize people in society. So this could be something as simple as having an iPhone, getting the new iPhone 6. This is a silly example, but that idea, it shows status by this symbol. And it's not always necessarily going to be something tangible, but it's something that represents status. And so when we're talking about symbolic violence, it's not talking about violence necessarily in the literal term. It can lead to violence, but it's not necessarily. But it's about a maintenance of the status quo through hegemonic ideology. So living in an androcentric, meaning a male-centered world, and how males are supposed to act, and this idea of being manly and what that means. That idea that is very, very prevalent in American culture, for sure, is a way that symbolic violence acts against, in terms of like gender equality or sexual equality, because of it portrays this norm of what should be in terms of gender. So that's one term that is used in the readings this class period. Another one that I wanted to bring up because I thought was relevant, it didn't go into much detail, but gender policing, this comes out of Judith Butler's work, and she's a feminist scholar. And this is this idea of like these socially constructed norms of how boys and girls are supposed to behave. So why I think this is so important is because of this gender binary that's set up in schools. And I will be honest to you, of all the social justice work that I do, this is probably the hardest for me when we think about gender norms in terms of when we talk about this binary of boy versus girl. It starts so early. I was just at a baby shower this past weekend, and it's the typical, it's pink for girls, blue for boys. That is so ingrained in our society that we don't even think twice about it. As I'm with my nieces and nephews, how one gravitates towards superheroes and one gravitates toward Disney princesses. This is just something that, talk about hegemony starting really young and impacting little kids from the get-go, and how we continue to do this in schools as well. So that's a really important thing to think about as we're talking about all of these different dynamics in terms of gender and sexuality. Now, the LGBTQ terms, LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. That's just one term. There's several different ways that people talk about it. Some people add I for intersex, and I'm sure there's letters that I'm probably missing. What I would like to point out about this umbrella of terms in general, and I'm just going to say LGBTQ more than likely to when I'm talking about people who don't represent heteronormativity, is that these terms are fluid. They're changing. We always have to question who has the power to decide how we are named. The way that I look at this when I'm talking about differences in people is that I do the best I can to ask people how they identify and want to be identified, and just try to be as respectful as you can in allowing people to name their own identities. But inevitably, we live in a society of labeling, so we need to be as cautious and as mindful about how the terms that we use. And when we make a mistake, we work to fix that mistake and to move and to be able to learn from that. So thinking about that, the last term that I'll kind of go over is queer and queer theory. Pennell uses the term queer, and she defines it, I quote, to refer to any individual who's not heterosexual and does not live within the confines of heteronormativity, end quote. And heteronormativity, I should have added that as a term on here too. This speaks to the idea that man marries woman, woman marries man, man ascribes to this ideas of masculinity, women ascribes to femininity, and it's a binary that's set up. So it's very clear. So anytime you go outside any of these what are considered norms, this is queering the situation. So queer theory, you might have, if you've never heard this before, you might think of queer in the way that it was used in a derogatory way. But in academia, it's been taken back and reappropriated in research, and it's associated with disrupting categories. So any category that was assigned, queer theory is about disrupting that, and an argument that identity is not static. It changes over time, just like language changes over time. So we always need to be thinking about what we mean and how we're talking about it. Okay, so this week we had two different, I'm going to first start with talking about these gender norms. So the documentary on Tough Guys and masculinity and gender really associates how contemporary American masculinity is really associated with violence, and this is everything to do with this perception of the male being strong and unemotional, and it has everything to do with how males are supposed to behave or perform masculinity, as well as how they're supposed to appear. So interestingly, in the documentary, the speaker was talking about just even looking at how body images have changed from the 50s to now with like superheroes or with women. Like we could look at it that way in terms of how you're actually physically also supposed to look. And masculinity is this macho idea. It is a very gendered phenomenon. Also, there's a lot of different issues of how race, ethnicity, and religion are also constructed. So just as we were looking at the Real Bad Arabs documentary, Tough Guys also really highlights how the media very much plays a role in constructing this. I believe there's also a really important point brought up of how we position people. So even thinking about the dominant versus subordinate groups is how the speaker in the documentary, I forget his name, but how he talks about how this perpetuates those in power, about how we position. So even having the conversations, which is really hard not to do, we often position those in power from whatever intersection we're looking at in those terms. So some of the questions that are really being looked at is like this idea of what are a real man. What is this narrative of manhood, and how does race intersect with masculinity? So these images we see in movies about Latino, Asians, white, black men, what are these perceptions? And then Serrier gives even coming from a different perspective, being a feminist, writing about talking about her experiences as both a teacher and also a mother, and how she sees about how masculinity is performed in schools, and how this is something that teachers do and set up. And I've been in these situations where it's so easy to see how we continue to perpetuate these norms because it's so normalized. It's so normalized in schools. Senso and D'Angelo enter this conversation when they begin talking about this with pop culture, and some of and they argue that pop culture, which I believe that the Tough Guys speaker would also agree, these are some of the strongest forces really shaping our perceptions of, or shaping our socialization and how we think about these things. So from Tough Guys, excuse me. I took this right from the study guide here. There's a bunch of statistics here that really perpetuate or really confirm violence among male, and there's a ton of statistics here. It's quite alarming, and the creators of Tough Guys here would assert that a lot of this has to do with the media and how we're shaping, looking at how media has the prevalence of it, and there's also studies and research here as well talking about how this perpetuates violence among men. So you can look and read through these statistics here. Senso and D'Angelo, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I pulled out just a few of their statistics, but they are talking about oppression here through sexism. So they're positioning this now, talking about this through a female lens. They also are talking about violence, but they're talking about women as victims of violence in this situation. So a couple of the statistics that we can see here is about 80% of the people trafficked are women. We do know that trafficking affects women more in developing nations than higher rates than in the U.S. and Canada. But violence against women is considered under the human rights. It's a human rights violation around the world, affecting 1 in 2 women. 3 billion of the world's population are women, so this means 1 billion of them are affected by gender-based violence. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in the U.S., and 1 in 6 have been a victim of rape. And then probably one of the most common discussions that I hear when we're talking about gender disparity is the wage gap. We know that this is still prevalent. Women are underemployed, and they make up an overwhelmingly population of unpaid workers in the home. And when women who do work, they're overrepresented in minimum wage positions. And then, of course, this statistic is showing in the U.S. and Canada, women earn 65 to 80% of their male counterparts. So this is still an issue. So they really talk about why sexism is so difficult to see, why we think this is a thing of the past, not necessarily an issue that we really have to fight with anymore because of women's rights and women can do everything. And just like we see these myth and meritocracies when we talk about people of color, we have a black president, we see women in all these positions of power, in CEO positions, and people are it's easy to make the argument, well, we no longer have gender inequality anymore. Even to complicate this even further, they ask, why does mainstream culture position women's oppressions as a problem of marginalized societies, developing nations or people living in poverty, rather than a pervasive system that affects all women throughout the world, mediated by their additional social positions of race, class, sexuality, and other identities? So essentially they're arguing here that this is a global problem in terms of women's oppression, and it's somehow, and while we might suggests, oh, in America we have this and that, and therefore women are no longer oppressed. We have a woman who's going to run for president. These arguments, these narratives that we hear. But those third world countries, that is where that's where we really see women being oppressed. And they use the example of how we construct westernized women versus Eastern women, and particularly Muslim women, and how in a Western narrative it constructs women who are Muslim as oppressed, when that's not the case in many cultures. And so an example of this in the U.S. where we have our troubles, or women are oppressed very much in the U.S. as well, is when we talk about transgender women in the U.S. And I included an article here from the Huffington Post that you can click on. But there's been, since 2015, there's been over 8, there might be more, that was the last statistic I looked at, murders, though, of transgender women of color, and there's continuously no justice sought for these women, and that's just one example of oppression that we see in this culture, and that's, of course, intersecting both race and sexual orientation here, or gender identity, I should say. So when we think about oppression, and they argue as well in their chapter, when we define oppression as the reason that they feel that sexism continues to be so invisible to us is because we often look at oppression as these individual acts. We've talked about this before. We don't think of oppression always as this bigger system. And so we don't talk about the way institutions continue to hold sexism and gender norms in place. So a simple little example of bathrooms, thinking about male-female bathrooms and this complexity of social identity. Not everything fits in this binary. It's not this clear-cut masculinity versus femininity. And they go through these examples in popular culture, so how girls are perceived in sport, the discourse of sexism in music videos. So they're arguing about the representations of female sexuality. They say packaged as empowerment, control, and liberation for women, but is that really what's happening here, or are these just women being exploited? I was going to include this video by Bell Hooks. She did a critique of Beyonce and Nicki Minaj and their newest stance toward feminism, but it was over an hour long, so I might send it to you all as an attachment if you're interested in looking at it. Okay, so transitioning from thinking about gender norms and what this looks like in society, there were two of the readings in documentary now is specifically looking at sexual orientation. So the Speak Up documentary is really an informative documentary. It was developed, it came out of the initiative from the Gillespie Foundation, and their focus is to increase awareness about LGBTQ youth in schools. And they do it a lot through this lens of bullying. So you could look at these statistics here in terms of LGBTQ students in schools and their experiences with bullying, or their safety, how they feel safe in schools versus people who identify as straight. And clearly that is a problem. But I think something else, so I include this because I do think it's important, and absolutely bullying is a huge issue in schools, and safety is huge, and we know suicide rates related to LGBTQ issues in youth is higher than that of students who do not identify as LGBTQ, and so this is clearly an issue, no doubt. But much of the rhetoric that we see around LGBTQ issues in schools is centered around bullying. It's almost like, I almost look at it as like interest convergence, right? Because it's like, this is the safe way we can talk about it. And in fact, I have found that in my own research when I have worked with teachers trying to add LGBTQ issues into the curriculum or noticing issues. One teacher in particular that I worked with went to her principal really concerned about some of the bullying that was occurring for one of her students whose parents were, his moms were, he had 2 lesbians as parents. And there was a lot of bullying, so she really wanted to do something about it. Well, the principal didn't want to have a rally related to LGBTQ issues, but said that they could do something related to bullying. So essentially the problem was masked behind this concept of bullying, when really the root of the problem was the intolerance for the fact that this particular student had 2 gay moms. And so again, this is important to address bullying in schools, but I do think that it doesn't necessarily get to the root of the problem, which is how we're socialized in society. Again, this connects to gender norms, politics, and curriculum in schools. Currently, right now, only California it's the only state that includes LGBTQ or gay history, I believe it's how it's written in their standards, as a part of their history curriculum. So, I mean, when 1 out of 50 states is including that in as a part of a requirement in the curriculum, we still have a long way to go in terms of how we're addressing issues in schools, and also to give teachers the freedom to feel that they can do this. So I think this feeds nicely, though, into what Pennell's argument is, which I just want to take a second to talk about this article, especially for the people in this class who see themselves moving into academia. And I know people who had me last semester in the policy class, I kept talking about these types of things in academic writing. But I really appreciate how when Pennell begins this article, she spends some time, she positions herself as a queer white woman. She also names some of her, which she knows are some of her, I guess the word I'm looking for is, it's not weaknesses, I'll have to think of a better way to describe that, but some of the challenges she's facing as she's writing about these issues that are complicated and complex. So this is kind of a little idea that highlights what positionality looks like when you're writing, especially when you're writing about critical issues. So she spends some time doing that in the beginning. It's quick, but I feel like, especially as I'm reading this, it's helpful to me as the reader to know where she's coming from. She also spends some time defining her terms, which is really important, I believe, when we're writing about things like this. The only thing I'll say is, and I don't know if I missed it, but if you were wondering what POC is, I'm assuming she means people of color, although I don't see where she actually wrote that out, but that's how I read it through the article, so just putting that out there. And so, to talk about her work, Tara Yazzo, she wrote an article looking at, and I just talked about Pierre Bourdieu's work, and he talks about cultural capital. But a lot of times when he talks about it, a problem that has been, that some critical race theorists, particularly Tara Yazzo, has brought out, is that, well, whose culture has capital? And that's the name of the article that she wrote. This cultural capital is very much written in this white middle class standards. And while, yes, we could argue that, well, that's what is considered quote-unquote success in schools. But what she problematizes is that there's all these other forms of capital, aspirational, linguistic, familial, navigational, and resistant, that are very important to function in society. It may not fit per se the white stream norms of public schools and certain institutions within society. However, it doesn't mean that this is not capital that's valued within people of color's communities. So working from that framework, Pennell here just added to this, extended the linguistic capital argument and then added. So let's first talk about the linguistic cultural capital quickly. I've included, as I was reading this made me think of this piece by James Baldwin, and it was a 1979 article in the New York Times, and it's called "If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is." And so Baldwin talks here about how the necessity of having a language, it came out of, and I think particularly, there was a moment in time in this place where my brother or my mother or my father or my sister had to convey to me, for example, the danger in which I was standing from the white man standing just behind me, and to convey this with speed and in a language that the white man could not possibly understand, and that indeed he cannot understand until today. He cannot afford to understand it. This understanding would reveal to him too much about himself and smash the mirror before which he had been frozen for so long. And what Baldwin is saying here is that this African American language developed out of a need to be able, it came out of safety, to be able to communicate a black mother or a black father with his or her son and daughter. And so this cultural capital, again, in society, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about language, but what's considered quote-unquote standard English versus black English, in a Bourdieuian cultural capital framework, it's not considered cultural capital, but in Yazzo's view of linguistic cultural capital, black English is very much cultural capital, because that's become a part of survival. And so Pennell is adding to this description by talking about, in the same way that Baldwin's talking about this in the black community, Pennell is adding to this in the Pennell, and to use Pennell's language, the queer community. And about how borderland discourses, the ways of communicating, and a lot of times whether it be verbal or through words, deeds, values, feelings, she talks about these different ways of communicating and creative ways to recognize each other are how people within the queer community are able to communicate. And so it's really an extension of Yazzo's work in this way. She also talks a little bit about reclaiming language, so reappropriating terms, so how taking terms that historically have been considered derogatory, so she talks about the term queer mestiza body, and how in a Latina queer community that is been reappropriated. So, another way that this comes up, lastly, and this comes up again in her implications, is thinking about pronouns. So, this linguistic capital of maybe purposefully changing pronouns to use defiance of these norms. So it's also a little bit of this resistant type of capital that we're talking about here. But so something you may have not ever really thought about is in using he and she, what if you don't identify with he or she? And how does that fit into your identity? Because we know language is so powerful. So questioning that, reclaiming it, using other pronouns, this is all a part of this linguistic cultural capital. So that was the addition to Yaza, or that was she kind of worked with what Yaza already talked about, but then she added a sixth type of capital, transgressive capital. I have to say I found this very, very fascinating because up until recently, a lot of times as I've been doing LGBTQ ally work and talking about culturally relevant work in terms of working with LGBTQ youth, a lot of the ways that I found myself positioning this work was very much like we saw in the Speak Up documentary. Well, the problem is that there's bullying, so we have to think about how we can help these students. And it's very much pitting all these students as victims. And I'm not saying that there aren't victims, of course there are. But I think it's a really important distinction to think about how Pennell is pushing us to move from this like resistance where you're reactive. So you're reacting to situations to being proactive. So it's in my way of interpreting it, the way that I was looking at this is it's putting agency back with people. And so this exactly fits in, if you know anything about culturally relevant work, it's capitalizing on strengths. So this example that Pennell shares about I'm going to show a quick little snippet of this about the UndocuQueer manifesto, the UndocuQueer movement. But this is the example that Pennell uses to highlight the way in which people in queer communities, and in this particular case, we have the intersection of queer and undocumented immigrant communities. The way that the people are coming out and speaking and being and trying to counter. So again, this is also looking like counter storytelling to me, stereotypes of undocumented immigrants, and this is risky because there's risk of deportation. But let's just take a second to look at what this community is doing.
We demand the right to love and be loved by those who we choose.
We are who we are. We are human, and we will not tolerate violence, conversion,
or dividing forces against our queer and immigrant communities.
We are who we are. Let us be ourselves, our true selves.
We have beautifully crafted our lives, despite the injustice of being queer and undocumented.
Despite always being asked to separate the queer from our undocumented stories.
We have created Queer Familia within our movement because our survival depends on it.
Together we rise. We are Jodería, Familia de Corazón.
Somos Jotas, divas atrevidas, fabulous queers with a cause fighting towards social justice.
We are UndocuQueers in solidarity, fighting towards social justice.
We need to acknowledge that our lives are ever changing.
And regardless of the opportunities that may arise, we must always be there to support one another.
Because our lives, spirits, and existence didn't cross by accident.
Our love, our Jodería, and our transitions have traveled through mountains, rivers, deserts, and oceans.
And settled in the hearts of open minds.
We are all gente with different names, culture, cuerpos,
desires, roads, and different life philosophies.
Invested in working collectively towards the liberation of our sueños.
We are no more brothers and sisters than in the closet.
We seek to bring an end to the violence within our communities and families.
To end all racism, sexism, xenophobia, and poverty.
We seek to transform ourselves as we walk hand in hand with our many communities.
If you believe in social justice, then what makes us different than you?
We want to fight this war knowing our queer rights.
Immigrant rights are queer rights. Queer rights are immigrant rights.
Don't make us choose one. We are one.
We want our voices to be heard without being judged.
Our families are diverse and unique.
We have UndocuQueer love, unconditional love.
Lover, loving, lovemaking.
And love being meant to be fluid, meant to be free of shaming.
Therefore, we need to acknowledge that isms exist in our communities.
We are continuously transforming our communities and each other.
Not destroyed because of culture, sexuality, or color.
Somos jotas, jotos, divas, atrevidos, atrevidas, fabulous queers with a cause fighting towards social justice.
Soy tu vecino, tu vecina, tu hijo, tu hija, tu primo, tu prima, tu amigo, tu amiga. Tenemos corazón. Somos humanos.
Que no lo vea papá en la azotea.
Okay.
Cambiándole la ropa a las mujeres.
So this video as a campaign here, it's really is working to thinking about humanizing not only undocumented immigrant people who identify as undocumented, but also people who identify as queer. So what Pennell is really getting at here is that this particular group is being proactive. So they're not waiting until they're deported per se or denied privileges for being gay, but they're being proactive by using social media and protest and education to really inform communities about these intersections in their lives and how their humanity as well. So that this idea of transgressive capital is something that I think that we sometimes maybe overlook when we're talking about LGBTQ youth, because the proactiveness is been a very big part of the community since for decades, as people who have identified as LGBTQ have been fighting for their rights. So they're not these helpless passive victims who are in need of our saving, but they hold agency, and we can learn from that as well. And that's what Pennell is talking about here when talking about this transgressive capital. Okay, so as you go through this week, I recommend you start with, I always say the Stencil and D'Angelo is always helpful, and then work through the documentaries. Remember that I've changed all the discussion posts to midnight, so they're still going to be Tuesdays and Thursdays, but they're not due till midnight. And then same thing with 24 hours later. And then for our next class, we're going to be moving into class and poverty, or poverty and class, if you will. So you're going to start with, I recommend reading it in this order as well too. Anyan's work, this is her second edition of the book. She's really going to set the stage contextually in terms of the economic landscape of the states. So that part in part one. And then so Gorski and Dudley Marley's, I took a different approach when talking about class this week, and it's looking at some of the ways that we react to students living in poverty in schools. So I'm gonna share some information about this background to the book Ruby Payne. Some of you might be in schools that have used Ruby Payne, but Gorski's piece is actually an argument against Payne and talking about how Payne is looking at poverty in a deficit manner. Dudley Marley's piece is also very similarly doing the same thing by talking about language and how we look at language in terms of capital again here in a deficit manner. So these are examples of the actual implications of poverty in schools versus reading about students who are poor, and these aren't how-to scenarios of working with students who are poor. So keep that in mind as you're reading. And then lastly, there's one documentary for the class here. This is probably one of my favorite documentaries of all time. It's in the 90s, so it's incredibly outdated, but and some of the statistics are off because it's old, but I think that the message and the argument within it is very pertinent. The Secrets of the SAT, and it really looks, we're going to talk about class and really how standardized testing in class in particular intersect here. So definitely think about that as you're reading through the themes of the week, thinking about these things. As always, please email me with any questions if you have anything more to say or add, or if I left something out of this discussion or anything like that. By all means, either email me or feel free to use the comments on the YouTube page as well. Have a great week, everyone.